The suburbs of Washington, D.C. were peaceful, nestled under the weight of quiet trees and pristine streets. However, as night fell, something much darker stirred. Hidden beneath the surface of this tranquility, a deadly game of cat and mouse was about to unfold. The Mexican cartel, one of the most brutal and feared in the world, was targeting a seemingly harmless mansion in Ironwood Valley. It should have been an easy mission, one they expected to be quick and bloodless. But they were gravely mistaken. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, sat in the dimly lit study of her mansion. The soft hum of her laptop was the only sound that filled the room. Her sharp features were illuminated by the glow of the screen as she scanned the encrypted intelligence reports from her FBI contact. This wasn't just another late-night work session. Her heart raced, but her expression remained as cold and controlled as ever. For years, she had faced media attacks, political conspiracies, and now, an even greater threat from a deadly cartel. They thought they could target her because of her role in championing the president's anti-cartel policies. What they didn't know was that Karoline was no ordinary politician. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, as if warning of the approaching storm. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the encrypted message, *Mexican cartel inbound for revenge. 30 minutes out, she took a deep breath, steadying herself, before slipping out of her chair and striding down the marble-tiled hallway. Her heels clicked sharply, echoing through the empty mansion. She passed a painting on the wall and pressed lightly on the frame. A hidden door slid open, revealing a high-tech control room. Inside, the screens flickered with activity. Surveillance cameras showed every angle of the estate, front gate, backyard, the road leading to the mansion. It was a fortress, and every inch of it was protected. Motion sensors, hidden traps, concealed speakers, all primed and waiting. Karoline's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her sharp eyes flicking between the feeds. Black SUVs cut through the night, headlights off, moving stealthily toward the mansion. She didn't need to guess. This was it. They were here. Felix Reyes, the cartel boss with cold, unblinking eyes and blood-stained hands, was leading the attack. Karoline recognized him from the intelligence briefings. He was a ruthless man, someone who had ordered the deaths of countless people. But to him, she wasn't a threat. She was just a politician. He thought she was weak, an easy target. The reality, however, would prove him wrong. Through the surveillance cameras, Karoline saw Felix's team, 15 assassins, highly trained and armed with daggers, silenced pistols, and explosives. They moved swiftly, like a well-oiled machine, calculating every step. The first group was heading for the front gate, the second was moving toward the backyard, while the third stayed near the SUVs to provide backup. Karoline smirked faintly, her fingers gliding over the console. "You think I'm unprepared?" she whispered to herself. Felix stood just outside the estate, barking orders into his walkie-talkie. "Check the fence. Cut the power. 5 minutes to breach." He was confident, too confident. The cartel thought they had the upper hand. They thought she was alone. They were wrong. Karoline pressed a button on her console, and the backup power system kicked in instantly, keeping the mansion lit and cameras rolling. One of the assassins approached the steel fence surrounding the estate, pulling out a metal cutter. The dry scrape of metal echoed in the still night. Karoline's eyes narrowed. She saw the red dot blinking on her screen. "Trap 1 is live," she murmured. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, and the trap was triggered. On the screens, the first group of assassins froze as high-intensity LEDs flared to life from the porch ceiling, blinding them with a flash of white light. The men stumbled, shielding their eyes, guns clattering to the ground. Felix spun around, his face darkening behind his sunglasses. "She knows we're here," he growled into his walkie-talkie. Panic was starting to set in, but Karoline was far from finished. She hit another button, and through the outdoor speakers, a piercing siren wailed, creating an illusion of sirens blaring from every direction. Felix's team hesitated, their nerves rattled by the fake police sirens. Karoline smiled faintly. "They're rattled now," she muttered to herself. "Let's keep them that way." The assassins in the backyard were in disarray, their confidence shattered by the noise. Some retreated, others froze. Felix, however, was relentless. "Regroup," he commanded, but even his voice wavered with uncertainty. He was losing control. Mark Hudson, a former Secret Service agent who had worked closely with Karoline at the White House, was already on his way. His SUV sped down the dark road, headlights off to avoid detection. Leah Smith, a brilliant young tech engineer, was beside him, tapping away on her laptop. James Carter, a military veteran and political ally of Karoline, was in the back seat, checking his handgun and making sure his jamming device was in place. They had received Karoline's encrypted message minutes earlier and were already mobilizing. 3 minutes out, Mark said, his voice steady through the earpiece. Karoline's team arrived just in time. The SUV slipped through a hidden east side gate, and the garage door slammed shut behind them. Mark, Leah, and James grabbed their gear bags, non-lethal weapons, thermal scanners, remote controls, and more. They were ready. Karoline met them at the bunker entrance, her heels clicking on the cold stone floor. "They're in the front yard," Mark reported, scanning the surveillance screens over her shoulder. "Felix is running the show." Karoline didn't flinch. "He thinks I'm easy prey," she said, her voice icy. "Let's give him a surprise." Leah plugged her laptop into the mansion's security system, taking control of the tech traps. "Nerve gas and smoke screens are ready," she reported. James, his hand on his handgun, stood by, his eyes sharp. "We'll jam their comms when you give the word." Karoline studied the screens, her mind working in overdrive. Through the surveillance footage, she saw Felix's assassins moving closer. They were within striking distance. But Karoline was a step ahead. She could see their every move, anticipate their next. "Activate the next trap," she instructed. Leah pressed a button, and within seconds, the steel panels on the porch door slammed down, trapping the assassins inside. The glass door vibrated, emitting a cracking sound. But it was a trick, fake cracking, designed to lure them into a false sense of success. As the last assassin kicked hard at the door, a white mist sprayed from the doorframe, a mild nerve gas that made them dizzy and disoriented. They collapsed on the porch, unable to fight back. Felix saw his team unraveling. His confidence was crumbling, and he roared into the radio, "Pull back. Regroup." But Karoline wasn't about to give him any room to recover. She turned to James. "Jam their comms. Now." Felix's radio crackled with static. He slammed it to the ground in frustration. The jamming was working, his team was isolated, unable to coordinate. Panic began to spread through his ranks. In the control room, Karoline's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. She could see the chaos unfolding on the screens. Felix's team was unraveling, disoriented and unsure of what to do. The assassins in the front yard were still struggling with the nerve gas, while the backyard group had retreated, rattled by the fake sirens and gas from hidden speakers. "They're falling apart," Karoline said, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Keep up the pressure." Leah typed quickly on her laptop. "I've got their next move. They're preparing for a full assault. But they're still in disarray." James stood by, eyes fixed on the screens. "Let's not give them a chance to regroup." Karoline turned to her team. "We have one shot at this. Let's make it count." The seconds seemed to stretch as Karoline watched the chaos unfold. Felix and his men were no longer acting with military precision, they were panicked, disjointed. They hadn't expected to encounter this kind of resistance, and it was already beginning to crack their resolve. Karoline knew this was the moment to finish the job. But she also knew Felix wasn't stupid. He'd send for backup, and the next wave would be tougher to deal with. She turned to her team, her voice firm. "We're not done yet. They're regrouping, but they're still scattered. We need to finish this now." Mark, his hands gripping his non-lethal gun, nodded. "Got it. I'll handle the front. Keep them pinned." James stood by, his jamming device ready, a tight focus in his eyes. "If they try to communicate, I'll shut them down instantly." Leia's fingers flew over her laptop, eyes scanning the screens. "The second group's moving to the breach in the backyard. I'll lock them down with the next wave of traps." Karoline smiled faintly. The team had been flawless so far. She turned back to the control room, her gaze narrowing. Through the cameras, she could see Felix standing in the yard, barking commands at his remaining men. His confidence was shaken, but his pride kept him moving forward. He was determined to finish what he'd started. But that would be his biggest mistake. Karoline's fingers hovered over the console. She had one final trap to trigger. She waited for the exact moment when Felix's team would feel like they were on the verge of success. That was when she would strike. The front yard assassins, still reeling from the nerve gas, had regrouped. They were inching closer to the porch. Felix was beside them, barking orders, trying to maintain control. Karoline knew that the moment they breached the door, they would think victory was within reach. "Now," she said quietly. Leia pressed the button. From the ceiling above the porch, steel panels shot down, sealing off the entire front yard. The assassins had no way to escape. The porch became a prison. Panic ensued as they struggled to break through the reinforced walls, but Karoline had anticipated everything. The trap had been set perfectly. Felix watched in disbelief as his team's final assault crumbled. He turned to one of his men. "Get the big guns," he growled. "We're blasting this door open. Now." Karoline's eyes glittered with determination. She wasn't going to let them break through. The moment Felix tried to bring in heavier artillery, the mansion would show its full power. Through the surveillance screens, Karoline saw the third group, still outside, moving toward the SUVs. They had the heavy artillery, rifles, grenades, even a plasma cutter. They were preparing for a brute force attack. Karoline's fingers tapped the keys swiftly. A message popped up on Leia's laptop. "Activate the backup security system," Karoline instructed. Leia nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The security system clicked into place, activating a grid of motion sensors around the perimeter. If they tried to break in, they would be incapacitated before they got close. Karoline glanced at James, who was already holding his jammer, ready to cut off any communications the cartel might try to send. "They're making their move," James said, his voice low but steady. "I'll jam their signals the second they step into range." Karoline turned to Mark. "Are the traps ready?" Mark nodded, adjusting his non-lethal gun. "Ready to go." "Good," Karoline said, her eyes hardening. "Let's finish this." Outside, the cartel's final assault began. The assassins with the heavy artillery moved toward the breached door, their weapons raised. The others scrambled to take cover. Felix gave his orders, his voice laced with frustration. "Move. Don't let her beat us." But Karoline had already won. As the assassins approached, she pressed the button. From the shadows of the yard, mobile floodlights clicked on, blinding the cartel members and disorienting them. They fumbled, their eyes burned by the intensity of the light, and just as they began to recover, the smoke screens from the drones activated. Thick, white smoke filled the yard, creating a wall of fog, disorienting the cartel further. Felix's men stumbled, completely blind. "Now," Karoline whispered. James flipped the switch, and suddenly, the sound of helicopter blades roared through the outdoor speakers, followed by the distant sound of police sirens. Felix's men froze, their nerves on edge. They had no idea where the sounds were coming from, but they feared they were surrounded. Felix shouted into the walkie-talkie, but his voice was met with a dead, empty static. The jamming was working perfectly. The cartel was isolated and cut off from each other. Felix, seething with anger, grabbed his radio, but his orders were futile. Through the surveillance feed, Karoline could see the panic setting in. The front group was blinded by the floodlights and lost in the fog. The backyard group, who had just breached the wall, were trying to escape, but they had no way out. They were trapped in a cage of steel. Karoline smirked, watching them unravel. "They've lost their nerve," she said, her voice steady, almost calm. Leah leaned over her laptop. "They're retreating. The team in the backyard is stuck. The ones in the front can't see anything. They're completely isolated." Karoline stood and glanced at the surveillance screens. Felix was pacing in the yard, his walkie-talkie useless, his men scattered. He had been completely outplayed. "It's over," Karoline said, her voice colder than ever. "We've taken the head, but it's not over yet." Just then, the distant sound of engines rumbled through the night air. Karoline's eyes darted to the screen. "More backup," she said, barely able to suppress a smile. "The real test is coming." Felix, completely unaware of the impending backup, was still barking orders into the radio. His voice was desperate. "Pull back. We need to regroup." Karoline turned to her team, her voice icy. "They'll bring in their reinforcements. We won't give them a chance to escape. We need to keep them isolated until the FBI arrives." Mark nodded. "We'll hold them here. They won't get out." Leia's fingers were already flying over her laptop. "Drones will keep watch. We'll know if they try anything." James stood by, adjusting his jammer. "If they try to communicate again, I'll cut them off." Karoline nodded in satisfaction. "Perfect. Let them think they're in control. We'll hit them when they least expect it." The rumbling of engines grew louder as the cartel's reinforcements approached, but Karoline knew they wouldn't make it in time. She and her team had anticipated every move, and now the cartel was walking straight into a well-planned trap. Karoline's fingers danced over the keyboard one last time, triggering a final wave of defenses. The mansion, once just a home, was now an impenetrable fortress. Through the surveillance screens, Karoline saw a silver SUV approach. The vehicle slowed as it neared the property line, its headlights flickering off to avoid detection. Inside, the new group of cartel members were ready to storm the mansion. Karoline knew that these were not the same inexperienced men who had fallen for her tricks earlier. These were the elite, the ones who had been sent when the first wave failed. Their leader, Javier El Cuervo Morales, was a dangerous figure, not to be underestimated. He was rumored to be one of the most ruthless members of the CJNG, and he had come to reclaim his cartel's honor. El Cuervo, Karoline whispered under her breath as she watched the new group on the screens. "Let's see what you've got." Mark, Leah, and James had already positioned themselves, ready for whatever would come next. Mark was in the yard, keeping an eye on the entrance. Leah had full control of the drones, scanning the area for any movement. James stood at the control panel, his jammer poised to cut off any signals the cartel might attempt to send. El Cuervo's team approached cautiously, their vehicles coming to a slow stop just outside the perimeter. The men disembarked, pulling heavy rifles from the trunks, ready to engage in what they believed would be a quick assault. But Karoline's eyes remained cold and focused. This wasn't going to be quick. It was going to be their final mistake. Leia's fingers glided over her laptop, adjusting the settings for the floodlights and smoke drones. "Floodlights are set," she murmured, "and the drones are locking onto their positions. Let's see them try to make it through this fog." Karoline's lips curled into a thin smile. When they think they're in control, hit them with everything we've got. James checked the system and looked at Karoline, his voice calm but determined. Multi-frequency jammer is locked. They won't get a signal through. Karoline turned to Mark, her gaze sharp. When they breach, trigger the floodlights. Make them panic. Mark nodded, checking his gear one last time. They won't get far. Outside, El Cuervo's men began advancing, moving slowly but with deadly precision. They were close. Too close. Karoline's hand hovered over the button, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The tension in the air was palpable as she watched them draw nearer. And then it happened. The moment they crossed the perimeter, the floodlights exploded to life, blinding them with a fierce intensity. At the same time, the drones released a thick fog that enveloped the entire yard, disorienting the cartel men. They stumbled, their vision completely obscured by the smoke. Their weapons were useless in the haze, and confusion spread like wildfire among their ranks. Now, Karoline commanded. Leia activated the next phase. From the outdoor speakers, the sound of helicopter blades roaring through the night sky filled the air. The sound was deafening, amplified by the fog and lights, making the cartel members believe they were surrounded by federal forces. El Cuervo shouted orders into his radio, but his team could no longer communicate. They were trapped, isolated, and terrified. The sense of control they once had evaporated as they realized the mansion wasn't just a target, it was a death trap. Karoline leaned back in her chair, watching the panic unfold. They wanted to take us down. Now they're the ones on the run. Outside, the cartel men were scrambling, their minds racing as they searched for any escape. But it was too late. The perimeter was locked down tight, and there was no way in or out without triggering the next wave of traps. The floodlights, the smoke, the fake alarms, everything had been perfectly timed to create chaos. The last of El Cuervo's men who had tried to breach the yard dropped to the ground, immobilized by the electric grid hidden just beneath the surface. They had no idea what hit them. The energy surged through the grid, incapacitating them before they could take another step. Mark stood at the ready, watching as the remaining cartel members froze, caught in the trap. His hand hovered over his weapon, waiting for Karoline's signal. "They're not going anywhere," he said, voice calm but full of purpose. Karoline smiled faintly. "Perfect." James adjusted the jammer once more. "The comms are still down. They're isolated. Let's wait for the cleanup crew." Leia checked the drones, ensuring that all angles were covered. "They won't get close again. Everything's secure." Karoline exhaled slowly, her mind focused. The final test was over. They had withstood the cartel's most elite operatives and emerged victorious. But it wasn't just the technology or the traps that had saved them, it was the strategic thinking, the careful planning, and the anticipation of every move. Karoline had turned her mansion into a fortress, not just for herself, but for the entire country. Outside, the sirens of the approaching FBI vehicles were faint but growing louder. The cavalry had arrived. Karoline turned to her team, eyes gleaming. "We've done it. Let's make sure they don't forget this." As the FBI arrived and began securing the mansion, agents moved swiftly through the property, arresting the remaining cartel members. El Cuervo and his team, once feared and powerful, were now prisoners. They had underestimated Karoline, and that would be their undoing. Karoline watched as El Cuervo was loaded into an armored vehicle, his cold eyes still fixed on her, though he could no longer hide his fear. She walked to the front yard, where reporters had already gathered, their cameras capturing the moment of victory. Her team stood behind her, each of them exhausted but satisfied. Karoline stepped up to the makeshift podium, her voice ringing clear. "Good morning. I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary. Last night, my mansion was attacked by a Mexican cartel led by Felix Reyes and El Cuervo Morales. They failed. All of them. The crowd of reporters buzzed as cameras flashed. Questions erupted, but Karoline remained composed. This wasn't just an attack on me, it was a message to the American people. They thought they could intimidate us, but they were wrong. This mansion, with all of its technology and defenses, stood as a testament to what we're capable of. They wanted violence. We gave them a lesson in strategy. One reporter raised their hand. How did you do it? No casualties, no violence? Karoline smirked. We didn't need guns. We used technology, intelligence, and teamwork. That's what made the difference. The reporters were quick to jot down notes, but Karoline wasn't finished. She turned to the camera, her gaze unwavering. This victory wasn't just mine. It's America's. The president's anti-cartel policies are working. The message is clear: if you come for us, you will lose. We don't back down. The press conference continued, but Karoline knew this was just the beginning. The cartel had learned a hard lesson, and the world was watching. But as she stood before the media, she knew the most important part of this victory had yet to unfold. Her phone buzzed with a text message from the president's senior advisor, *outstanding. The president is watching. He wants to meet with you this afternoon, Karoline smiled faintly. She had turned this battle into a political victory, and now, the real work began. As the media frenzy settled down and the agents finished clearing the mansion, Karoline turned to her team. They had done more than survive, they had won. We've secured this mansion, she said. But we don't stop here. The next fight is already on the horizon. Mark, Leah, and James nodded. They were ready. They had been trained for this moment. And no matter what came next, they knew they would face it together. This marked the end of Karoline's battle with the cartel, but as she stood in the now quiet mansion, she knew this victory would resonate long after the dust settled. The mansion was no longer just a home, it was a symbol. A symbol of resilience. A symbol of power. And for the cartel, it was a warning: do not underestimate the power of intellect and strategy. And as the sun set over the mansion, Karoline Leavitt knew she had become something greater than a political figure. She had become a force, one that no cartel, no enemy, could ever challenge again.